Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors. Working on a predominantly black miniature and pulling off an effective in-scale look is one of the major challenges faced by model painters. The reason for this is deceptively simple. Black absorbs light, so it pushes your shades all the way to one end of the spectrum. But contrast, the perceived difference between light and dark tones, is crucial with miniatures. Unfortunately, black paint is the antithesis to this. So, with a lot of black paint on a model, establishing decent contrast is pretty much impossible. This is even more of an issue when painting miniature subjects. Large objects collect light differently than small ones because they cast their own shadows, and larger surfaces reflect more than small ones. This means that the miniature painter's process is centered around artificially exaggerating this. When done correctly, a 28mm tall subject provides the impression that it's in fact the size of a person, or a 7cm long piece of plastic becomes a tank. The shade of black, though, is just incapable of this because, again, it absorbs light. It doesn't reflect it. I've wanted to tackle working with black paint for some time, but since I moved from sci-fi and fantasy painting to historical subjects quite a few years ago, the need to paint significant amounts of black has become fairly uncommon. Tanks are usually predominantly green, and Napoleonic uniforms, well, they can be almost any color, but rarely black. Then Christmas came around, and one of my coworkers had a dilemma. Her daughter wanted a gift themed on the TV character Wednesday Addams, but nothing was available. And of course, Wednesday wears, you guessed it, predominantly black. Naturally, I volunteered the services of Miniature Landscape Hobby Studios to produce a Wednesday figurine, and now I had the subject I needed. In this video, I'm going to take you through the general theory and my method for painting predominantly black miniatures, though I'm going to cover the rest of the paint technique for this figurine as well. So with that out of the way, let's get to it. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank my Patreon supporters. Without their assistance, Miniature Landscape Hobbies would not be possible. If you would like to learn more about the benefits of becoming a Patreon supporter, please check the link in the video description. Finding a subject for Wednesday isn't that hard, as there are a ton of fan art figure sculpts available as STLs. I found one for free on Cults 3D by a user named LP Cupcake. The model is excellent, and I want to make sure LP gets full credit, so I've put the link in my video description. With this handled, I printed and assembled the model. It went smoothly, and the result, though I only had red clear resin to print with, looked great. Now it's time to prime the model, and this is where the theory starts. Because black doesn't reflect light, it's actually not a good place to start. We need to create some contrast to give volume to the black clothes, or the model will have no visual interest and not establish the impression that it's in fact a real-world person. So I mix black and gray primer to make a very dark, almost charcoal gray, and apply it over the model. I keep it a thin coat, but make sure to cover the entire model. When the primer is completely dry, it's now time to keep building layers. Next up, I spray NATO Black, which is also a very dark charcoal gray, only slightly lighter than the primer. I keep this directed at all but the deepest recesses on the model. This effectively becomes my base color for Wednesday's dress, shoes, and hair. Next comes a midtone. I mix about 3:1 gall gray to NATO black and spray this on. Since I assume that the imaginary light source for viewing the model is to her front and slightly above, I spray Wednesday's dress, hair, and shoes with my airbrush in this direction. I keep the application light and tight to the higher features. Now I hear you say, most of this involves an airbrush, and that's true. I always recommend airbrushing for large, smooth surfaces, but you could use acrylic layers to achieve the same effect. Now the volumes are there on the clothing and hair, but we need to pick out the extreme edges and folds in the clothes to create the impression of reflecting light. To do this, I mix light gall gray with a little white, and taking out a fine brush, I trace the large folds in her clothes and pick out the buttons on her dress. Because her hair is black as well, I pick out the extreme edges and some of the more prominent strands on Wednesday's head. This highlight color also makes a fine starting point for the white lapels, leggings, and cuffs, so I apply this now too. At this point, it should be plain that the key to painting black is using dark gray instead. Gray gives a level of contrast, but if you keep it muted, it still implies that the subject is in fact black. However, the model is a little chalky, and the gradients between the layers are way too pronounced. Therefore, it needs to be unified, or sometimes this is called being filtered. This is the process of taking a color that's common to all the previous layers and applying it thinly over the top to subtly tint the layers and to tie them all together visually. In the old days, I'd need to thin acrylic paints into a wash, or apply a varnish, then look for an enamel filter from a scale model store. Fortunately though, in this day and age, we have zenithal paints, like those in the Citadel Contrast or Army Painter Speed Paint ranges, and we can call on these. So, I get out my Army Painter Grim Black, and mix it 3 parts thinner to 1 part paint. Then with a large brush, I just apply it evenly over the clothing, shoes, and hair. When the Grim Black is dry, the clothing looks just a little too flat. So, although I would consider this part optional, I go back with straight Grim Black and paint it into the deeper folds of the clothes, feathering it towards the edges. When this is dry, it implies the folds in Wednesday's dress are deeper than they actually are. At this point, the actual application of black is finished, but not the model. And since black is such a unique shade to work with, we need to go back to theory. Black on its own, as we've established, is bad for creating contrast, which we need to establish interest and scale. Using dark gray goes a long way to fix this, but not enough. Fortunately, Wednesday has some white details on her cuffs, collar, etc. This kind of builds a border around the image she gives off, and also makes it easier to draw attention to her face. Black and white, being opposites, means that you really can't build more contrast than this, so it works to our advantage. This, of course, isn't a coincidence. In real-world terms, this enhances the expressiveness of the character on TV. It also does the same for the miniature, drawing our attention to her face. When you consider composition of your models, this is a primary use for black. So now I go to work, getting out pure white, and I layer it over the light gray areas that I want to build. First, I thin the white heavily, about 50-50 with acrylic thinner, and draw it from the inside of the details out, so that it gathers more opaquely at the edges. Then when this is dry, I trace the edges with pure white again, basically unthinned, to make a hard, defined edge in white. Now we have the black areas looking good and have created contrast, but we can see the model is really all about Wednesday's face and expressions. Also, her face becomes extra important because first, as humans, we tend to naturally look at our subjects' faces. Second, the very black and white nature of this model basically forces us to concentrate on her face, so we need to maximize the visual interest by adding a variety of colors. I start here with Hull Red. I paint this onto her hands, face, and on Thing. That's the hand-shaped creature on her shoulder. This makes a nice substrate to add the missing warm tones to the model. Now I move through 2 layers. First a 50-50 mix of Hull Red and flat flesh, which goes over the whole face, leaving the hull red only in the deepest areas and in the border around her hair. Next is straight flat flesh, which I work into the broader reflective areas such as her cheeks and chin, as well as the highest points like the bridge of her nose. Light flesh comes next, as a highlight going to the highest and most prominent areas, particularly on her nose, her cheeks, and under her eyes. This is important to try to keep a fast transition from very light to very dark to draw the viewer's attention to Wednesday's eyes themselves. Flesh is, of course, a notoriously tough color to describe. Fortunately, we have Flesh Wash to help. This is a fabulous army painter product that both shades and unifies your skin colors. I put it on in a thin coat. You can layer this on thickly to build lots of depth if you want, but I keep it thin as I want the lighter areas to remain super distinct to emphasize the fair skin she has. When the shader was dry, I thinned a 50-50 mix of light flesh and white and went back over the highest areas to emphasize the highlights. Wednesday's eyes are now the next order of business, but I'm going to let you down a bit here, because it's such fine work, I could not get the work on camera in an adequate way. However, there's no real trick to this. Her eye sockets were already shaded almost black, so I grabbed white and a 000 brush and added a tiny drop of white to either side of the center, implying a pupil. Looking at Wednesday, we see the grays, white, and very light flesh tones are devoid of a much-needed splash of color. We really need a warm color to provide both a focal point for the viewer and a hint of her fiery emotion hidden under the cold and somewhat vacant facade of her face. If we look at a still image of the actress who plays Wednesday, we can see that they've addressed this in the real world with her bright lips, so naturally we'll do the same. Taking out the dark purple-red speed paint color called Murder Scene, which seems only appropriate considering the subject.
I'm a homicidal maniac. They look just like everyone else.
I thin this with 3 parts thinner and 1 part paint. I carefully apply it with a fine brush, and when it dries, it gives us a suitable reddish tone that still allows flesh tones to come through and it doesn't overpower the model. Although, in hindsight, if I could go back, I would make this effect a little more subtle and muted. Now the subject is done, and I go ahead and dry brush the base grimy gray. The base itself was made from textured vinyl glued to a balsa wood plank, which is intentionally very simple so as not to detract from Wednesday herself. The very last step is to ensure that the model is safe for handling, so I give it 2 coats of satin varnish and a final coat of matte varnish to protect it. And with that, the miniature is done. Wednesday now has a suitably dour yet foreboding appearance that evokes all the murderous cunning that her character represents. The dark gray layers work together to imply the black dress and hair while still preserving a sense of depth and contrast. Her bright white cuffs, leggings, and collar frame the major points of interest, and the warmer depth to her skin tones and sinister eyes add interest, color, and emotion. Now all I hope is that her new owner will be happy with this cool little model as a Christmas gift. If you'd like to learn more about the theory behind miniature painting, please watch this video, or consider watching this other video instead. Thanks for watching, and as always, remember to keep building life in miniature.